Lost in a blizzard on Christmas Eve, single father and his kids found more than shelter. The sky was already bruised with the warning of a storm by the time Jonathan Hale spotted the first flurries. What had begun as a quiet, gray morning had quickly turned into a violent swirl of winter, snow drifting across the wide Montana plains like restless spirits. Jonathan flicked the reins gently, trying to keep the horses steady. His fingers, stiff with cold, gripped the leather lines. "Just hold on, boys," he muttered to the team. "We're almost through the pass." In the back of the wagon, half buried beneath quilts, Eli and Lydia tried to stay warm. Their breath floated in soft clouds. The cold gnawed at every uncovered edge of their small bodies. Eli lifted his head, squinting past the swaying canvas flap. "Pa, is this storm gonna get bad?" Jonathan forced a reassuring smile he didn't feel. "Just a little blow. We'll beat it before nightfall." But he knew the truth. He could smell it in the air, taste it in the wind. This was no simple little blow. This was the kind of storm that swallowed men whole. The wind began to scream, tugging at Jonathan's coat, snatching his hat nearly off his head. Snowflakes hardened from tiny whispers to sharp pellets, stinging his face. Lydia whimpered, "Pa, I'm CC cold." Jonathan twisted around and reached back, brushing her cheek with a gloved hand. "I know, sweetheart. I know. We're gonna find warmth soon." But where? Their destination, a promised homestead near Ridge Creek, was still a day's ride away even in good weather. And their provisions were dwindling from the long journey after leaving Wyoming. Jonathan had hoped to arrive before Christmas Eve, but fate had other ideas. The wagon wheels creaked under the weight of the accumulating snow. The horses slogged forward, hooves sinking deeper with every step. Eli curled tighter under the blankets. "Pa, Mama wouldn't like this storm." Jonathan's throat tightened. It had been nearly a year since they'd lost her to fever. Some days it still felt like yesterday, like he could turn around and see her humming softly, braids swinging behind her as she stirred a pot over the fire. "She'd say we're tougher than any storm," Jonathan replied quietly. And she'd be right. He snapped the reins lightly, urging the horses on. Visibility dropped to a few yards. The world turned into a churning wall of white. The wind slammed against the wagon, rocking it side to side. The canvas snapped like a frightened bird's wings. Jonathan leaned forward, eyes narrowed, trying to see any sign of shelter. A tree. A cabin. A rise of land. Anything. But the snow erased everything. "Pa, I don't like this," Eli whispered. His voice shook, not from fear of the storm alone, but from something deeper, a fear he'd carried since his mother's passing. "I'm right here," Jonathan said. "I won't let anything happen to you." He meant it. With every beat of his heart, he meant it. Then suddenly, crack. The right front wheel hit something buried beneath the snow. A stump? A frozen rock? Jonathan never saw it. The wagon lurched violently. Eli screamed. Lydia toppled sideways. The horses reared, panicked and blind in the storm. Jonathan lost his grip on the reins. His boots slipped on the icy platform. The next moment he felt air beneath him. And then the ground slammed into his back, knocking the breath from his lungs. White filled his vision. Cold stabbed through his coat like a knife. "Pa!" Eli shouted from somewhere above him. Jonathan rolled onto his side, coughing. He struggled up, one hand braced against the swirling snow. The wagon listed sharply, the wheels splintered. One of the horses had bolted, rope ripped clean from the harness. The remaining mare tossed her head wildly, terrified. Jonathan staggered to the wagon. "Kids, are you hurt?" Eli crawled out first, holding Lydia with both arms. "We're okay, just scared." Jonathan lifted Lydia into his embrace, feeling how cold she'd gotten, how stiff her fingers were. "We can't stay here." His words came out hoarse, swallowed by the wind. "The wagon's done for." He scanned the barren landscape, a world of white moving in every direction, no form, no path. "Pa, where do we go?" Eli asked, voice cracking. Jonathan swallowed hard. He had no map for moments like this. No certainty. Only instinct, and a father's stubborn will. "We walk," he said softly but firmly. "We keep moving and we find shelter. As long as we stick together, we'll make it." He tore a thick quilt from the wagon, wrapped Lydia in it, then pulled Eli close under his arm. The storm clawed at them with icy fingers as Jonathan started trudging into the blizzard, boots sinking deep with every step, the children clinging to him. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know if shelter existed. But he did know one thing. No storm, no cold, no force of nature would take his children from him. Not tonight. Not ever. With every step, Jonathan pushed forward into the blinding white, praying silently, desperately. Lord, don't let us die out here. The wind swallowed his words. But far ahead, hidden by the storm, a single lantern flickered in the window of a cabin he could not yet see. And fate was already waiting for them. Jonathan's legs burned with each step, the cold biting through his boots like teeth. The storm had turned the world into a brutal, shifting landscape, every gust a shove, every drift a trap waiting to swallow them. He shifted Lydia higher in his arms. Her face was pressed against his chest, tiny breaths warming through his coat. Eli held onto Jonathan's sleeve with numb fingers, head bent low to shield his eyes. The wind shrieked, drowning almost every sound, until Eli tugged sharply. Pa. His voice was a thin thread in the storm. Pa, look over there. Jonathan blinked through the swirling snow, squinting past the drifts stinging his face. At first he saw nothing but white chaos. But then, a tiny glow. A faint, warm shimmer through the icy haze. A light. Jonathan stopped dead in his tracks. Do you see it? Eli whispered, as if afraid the storm would snatch it away if he spoke too loudly. I see it, Jonathan breathed. But he hardly dared believe it. It could be a trick of the snow, a memory his heart conjured out of desperation, the echo of lanterns he once saw on quieter evenings. Yet the glow didn't flicker out, it flickered stronger. Hold tight, Jonathan said, lifting Lydia and grabbing Eli's shoulder with the other arm. We're heading toward that light. He trudged forward, one painful step at a time. The snow was up to his shins, the wind smacking his face with icy fingers. Time became strange, stretching and collapsing. He wasn't sure if minutes or hours passed. But slowly the glow grew brighter. Then shapes emerged, blurry, blurred with snow. A fence. A slanted roof. A tall chimney exhaling smoke that rose in soft gray wisps before being shredded by the storm. A cabin. A warm, living cabin in the middle of a frozen wilderness. Jonathan's knees nearly buckled with relief. We made it, he whispered, breath catching. Lord above, we made it. He pushed on until the porch loomed before them, the boards dusted with a fresh layer of snow. Light poured from the windows, glowing gold against the blue-white storm. Jonathan shifted Lydia to one arm and reached out with the other, knocking hard. Thud, thud, thud. The storm swallowed the sound. He knocked again, louder, the cold making his movements jerky and desperate. Please, he whispered, pressing his forehead against the wooden door. Please let someone be home. Inside, footsteps approached, hurried, uncertain. The latch clicked. The door swung open. Warmth spilled over them like a wave. Framed in the glow of a lantern stood a woman. Early 30s, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, cheeks pink from the heat of the fire behind her. Snowflakes clung to the escaping strands of her auburn hair. Her eyes, green, gentle, startled, widened at the sight before her. Oh heavens, she breathed, hand flying to her mouth. You poor souls. Before Jonathan could muster a single word, she reached out, grabbing Eli and guiding him inside. Come in. All of you, quickly. Jonathan nearly sagged with relief as he stepped over the threshold, carrying Lydia in his arms. The door slammed shut behind them, muting the roar of the storm. The sudden silence felt unreal, almost holy. Heat radiated from the stone hearth. The smell of burning pine filled the cabin, thick and soothing, chasing the cold from Jonathan's bones. The woman pressed a hand to Eli's forehead, worry etched into every line of her face. You're freezing, she murmured. Sit by the fire, no arguments. She helped Eli toward a patchwork rug before the hearth and threw another log into the flames. Sparks flared upward, lighting the room with soft orange light. Jonathan turned to her, struggling to find steady breath. Ma'am, thank you. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't found your place. She looked at him with a mix of strength and softness, her gaze lingering on the children before returning to him. I'm Margaret Ellison, she said, voice low but firm. You don't owe me thanks. You were out there with 2 children in the worst blizzard this valley's seen in years. Anyone with a heart would have opened their door. Jonathan swallowed hard, feeling emotion clog his throat. I'm Jonathan Hale, he managed. This is Eli and this little one is Lydia. Margaret's expression warmed instantly. Hello, Eli. Hello, Lydia. Lydia blinked sleepily and reached a tiny hand toward her. Margaret took it gently, kneeling beside her. You're safe now, she whispered. Jonathan felt something invisible loosen inside him, a knot he'd been carrying for months. Maybe longer. Margaret hurried to a cupboard, pulling out wool blankets, wrapping each child with practiced hands. She set a kettle over the fire and grabbed a tin of peppermint cocoa. You'll have warm drinks in just a moment, she said, glancing back over her shoulder. Get yourselves comfortable. The storm's not going anywhere tonight. Jonathan lowered himself onto a nearby wooden bench, the heat working its way into his fingers. He watched as Eli's shivers began to ease, as Lydia leaned trustingly into Margaret's side. This cabin, this woman. They had stumbled onto a miracle. Jonathan bowed his head, whispering a silent breath of gratitude. Outside, the blizzard raged mercilessly. But inside, a light, gentle and steady, had taken them in. And though he didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of the warmth that would change all their lives. The cabin crackled with warmth as Margaret Ellison tended to the fire, the soft orange glow painting her face in gentle light. Jonathan watched her move, efficient, calm, unafraid of the chaos the blizzard had thrust into her quiet home. Steam rose from the kettle she'd set on the hearth. The smell of peppermint cocoa drifted through the room, sweet and nostalgic, wrapping around them with the same comfort as her blankets. Eli held the warm mug with both hands, blowing steadily until the steam cleared enough for a cautious sip. His eyes widened. This is the best cocoa I ever had. Margaret laughed softly, her voice warm like the fire. It's just milk, cocoa and a little peppermint bark I melt in. Old family trick. Lydia, still bundled tightly in one of the quilts, looked up at her shyly. You're nice. Margaret brushed a stray curl from Lydia's forehead. So are you, sweetheart. Jonathan's heart clenched, at the kindness, at the safety, at the gentle way this stranger seemed to understand exactly what his children needed without being told. He ran a hand through his hair, shaking melted snowflakes free. His coat and boots were drying near the fire. For the first time in days he wasn't fighting the cold. Margaret turned back to the hearth and lifted a small pot onto the fire. Stew will be ready soon. I usually make too much anyway. You're doing far more than we deserve, Jonathan said quietly. Margaret glanced back at him. Her eyes held no doubt. You deserve to be warm. And fed. And safe. That's not charity, that's humanity. The words hit him harder than he expected. They filled something inside him he didn't even know was empty. A quiet conversation by the fire. Later, with the children warm and drowsy, Margaret sat across from Jonathan at her small wooden table. She poured them both tea, hers with honey, his plain because he insisted he didn't want to be any trouble. Jonathan wrapped his hands around the mug, savoring the warmth. You live alone out here? He asked. She nodded, her expression softening. It was my parents' ranch. They passed a few years back. Fever took them fast. She swallowed gently. Since then it's just been me. I'm sorry, he murmured. She gave him a tired kind of smile. It gets lonely sometimes. But the land's good. The work keeps me busy. Jonathan stared into his tea, thinking of the letter that promised him a job and a homestead that might not even be waiting anymore. He hesitated before speaking. We were traveling toward Ridge Creek. I was offered work, caretaking a place for a rancher who moved east. But the wagon, he gestured helplessly. I don't know if it survived. Margaret's voice was gentle. How long have you been traveling? 3 days without stopping, he admitted. The kids, they've been brave. Braver than they should have to be. His voice cracked on the last word. Margaret reached across the table, not touching him yet but close enough that the intention comforted him. You're a good father, Jonathan. He blinked hard. Some days I feel like I'm just trying not to fail them. You didn't fail them tonight, she said. You brought them to safety. Her certainty steadied him in ways he didn't expect. The children find their place. Lydia eventually drifted off, curled up on the rug in front of the fire. Eli fought sleep longer, wanting to watch the flames dance, but even he couldn't resist the warm pull of exhaustion. Margaret brought over another quilt and tucked it around both children. Jonathan watched her with quiet awe. You're good with them, he said softly. She brushed her hands on her skirt, embarrassed but pleased. I always thought I'd have children someday. Life just didn't go that way. Jonathan's gaze softened. You'd make a wonderful mother. Her breath caught at the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to pause. The wind stilled. The cabin felt suspended in something tender and fragile. Margaret cleared her throat. I made up the spare room for you and the children. There's only one, but it's warm. You can rest as long as you need. Jonathan stood slowly, feeling the weight of the journey but also the relief of knowing their struggle had paused, if only for a little while. He bowed his head gratefully. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to, she said. Tonight this house has company again. That's thanks enough. A moment Jonathan would never forget. As he carried Lydia into the spare room, He glanced back and saw Margaret standing near the fire, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. She looked peaceful, strong, kind. Jonathan felt something shift inside him, subtle but undeniable. As he laid Lydia down on the soft bed and covered Eli beside her, he whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. For shelter. For warmth. For this unexpected woman who had opened her door without fear. Outside, the blizzard roared on, relentless and cold. But inside Margaret Ellison's cabin, the storm had already begun to lose its power. Warmth won. Kindness won. Hope began. And none of them yet understood just how deeply this night would bind their lives forever. Jonathan awoke to something he had not felt in a long time: stillness. No wheels creaking. No wind battering canvas. No desperate worry clawing at his thoughts. Instead he heard laughter. Soft, high-pitched, unmistakably joyful laughter. He blinked awake, momentarily disoriented. The room around him was warm, sunlit, and smelled of cinnamon and apples. A quilt, soft and handmade, covered him. Eli snored lightly beside Lydia, who was wrapped like a small cocoon, curls spilling over the pillow. For the first time in months, their faces looked peaceful. Jonathan sat up slowly, listening again. Lydia's little giggle drifted through the open doorway, followed by the gentle rumble of Margaret Ellison's voice. He rubbed his eyes, the memory of the storm flashing across his mind: snow, wind, fear, the broken wagon, the light in the distance, and then her. The woman who had welcomed them without hesitation. Jonathan pulled on his drying boots and stepped carefully into the hallway, drawn by the smell of baking apples and the sound of quiet joy. The kitchen was bathed in golden morning light streaming through the frosted window. Snow glittered outside like a sea of diamonds. But inside was warmth, movement, and something else entirely. A Christmas he didn't expect. Margaret stood at the small wooden table wearing a faded blue apron and a soft smile. Lydia sat beside her, swinging her legs under the chair, eyes bright. In front of them was a bowl of flour and sliced apples dusted with cinnamon. "Your turn to stir," Margaret told Lydia, handing her a wooden spoon. Lydia stirred with such enthusiasm that flour puffed up into a white cloud. Margaret laughed gently and caught her little hand to steady it. Jonathan leaned against the doorway watching them. For a moment he didn't want to speak. He didn't want to break the fragile beauty of the scene. It felt like a memory he should hold gently, with both hands and a grateful heart. But Lydia saw him and her whole face lit up. "Miss Margaret taught me how to make, she turned to Margaret for help. "Fritters," Margaret said with a smile. "Apple fritters. Christmas morning tradition in my family." Jonathan stepped in, voice warm. "Smells better than anything I've had in years." Margaret's cheeks flushed slightly. "Well, a blizzard changes plans, but I'd say unexpected guests make for a better Christmas." Jonathan's heart gave a slow, heavy thump. She turned back to the stove. "Eli's helping too. He chopped the apples himself." Eli, sitting on the floor by the fire whittling a tiny wooden horse, looked up proudly. "I didn't even cut myself, Pa." Jonathan chuckled softly. "You're practically a ranchman already." Margaret glanced at him with a fond smile. "He's a hard worker." They both are. Breakfast around a table that felt like family. When the fritters were crisp and golden, Margaret dusted them with sugar and placed them on a worn but well-kept serving plate. She set them on the small round table, where 4 wooden chairs waited, one more than she needed for herself. Jonathan couldn't help noticing that. They sat together, Margaret pouring warm cider, Lydia humming a tune, Eli staring hungrily at the stack of fritters. "Go on," Margaret said. "Christmas morning breakfast doesn't wait." Eli grabbed one and bit in, sugar dusting his lips. "This is the best thing I ever tasted." Margaret grinned. "Your sister said the same thing." Jonathan picked one up and took a slow bite. The flavors, apple, cinnamon, warmth, hit him with an unexpected wave of nostalgia. Things he thought he wouldn't taste again. Things that reminded him of his late wife, Clara, her gentle voice, the way she'd sing while cooking, the warmth of home they'd once shared. His eyes misted before he could stop them. Margaret noticed. Her smile softened and she reached across the table, laying her hand gently over his. Jonathan froze, breath catching. "I know what loss does," she whispered. "How it steals joy from every corner. But life has a way of nudging joy back in, when we least expect it." He swallowed hard. "It's been a long time since we had a Christmas that felt like Christmas." "Then let this be a start," she said. The simple words hit him deeper than he expected. A quiet exchange by the window. After breakfast, the children helped Margaret wash dishes, Eli drying, Lydia stacking plates clumsily but cheerfully. Jonathan stood near the frosted window, watching snow glisten under the bright winter sun. Margaret joined him, drying her hands on her apron. "It's beautiful out there," she murmured. He nodded. "Beautiful, and deadly. If not for your cabin," his voice tightened. "I don't like to think what would have happened." Margaret touched his arm. "Then don't. You're here. They're safe. That's all that matters." Jonathan looked down at her, really seeing her, her steady presence, her quiet strength, the softness she tried to hide in her eyes. "You didn't even hesitate to open your door," he said quietly. "Not many would do that." She shrugged gently. "I've spent too many cold nights alone to ever leave someone outside in one." Jonathan's expression softened. "You're a kind woman, Margaret Ellison. And you're a strong father, Jonathan Hale." Their gazes held, warm, steady, unspoken connection weaving between them like a thread. "The children bring a little magic." Later, Eli and Lydia sat beside the fire, crafting Christmas ornaments from scraps, carved wood, dried berries, bits of cloth. Margaret offered with a nostalgic smile. Eli held up a lopsided wooden star. "What do you think, Miss Margaret?" She examined it with dramatic seriousness, then smiled. "I think it's perfect. The tree outside could use a star." "You have a tree?" Lydia gasped. "A little pine by the porch. Won't hold many ornaments, but it doesn't need to. Just needs a few made with love." Jonathan watched his children beam with excitement, and something inside him swelled. Something he thought had frozen after Clara's death: hope. Margaret looked at him and said, softly, "It's been years since this house had laughter in it." Jonathan answered in the same gentle tone, "It's been too long since my children had a home with warmth." Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same log to add to the fire. Neither pulled away. Outside, the blizzard that had threatened to swallow them was gone, leaving behind a glistening white world. Inside, a quiet miracle was happening. A father and his children had found more than safety. They'd found healing, comfort, and the very first hints of something like love. The morning after Christmas arrived like a promise. Sunlight tilted through the frosted panes, turning the snow outside into a field of tiny, gleaming diamonds. Inside Margaret's cabin it felt ordinary and miraculous at once. Ordinary because of the routines of a working home, miraculous because laughter had lightened the rooms that had carried only quiet for too long. Jonathan woke slowly, muscles still sore from the hard ground and the marches through the storm. He dressed carefully, mindful of the small sounds coming from the next room. Eli's soft humming, Lydia patting about in Margaret's work-worn slippers. Margaret was already at the stove when he stepped into the kitchen, hands deft as she folded batter into a pan. "Morning," she said without turning. Her voice carried the easy warmth of someone who had learned her way around loneliness and chosen kindness anyway. "Morning," Jonathan replied, grateful and a little sheepish. Thank you again. For everything." Margaret glanced over her shoulder, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. "You don't need to thank me. Just get yourself some coffee before it goes cold." He did, watching her move, simple, unhurried motions that steadied him more than he expected. That afternoon he meant to repay some of that steadiness. Work to do, hands to use. After breakfast, Jonathan asked if there was anything he could help with. Margaret considered him for a moment and then nodded toward the lean-to in the barn. "The corral's loose by the north post," she said. "And the gate's been squeaking since last fall. If you can get the post braced and the hinge set, I'll be mighty grateful." Jonathan fetched tools and with Eli at his side, set to work. The children watched with interest, Eli eager to learn, Lydia collecting stray nails and offering them like little treasures. Jonathan's hands were made for work. They fit a hammer and a plane easily. As he drove a new brace into the post, Margaret handed him a cup of cider to warm his fingers. Their palms brushed and he felt the small, electric kind of awareness that says something is changing. "You're a careful worker," she said softly. "And you're a careful cook," he replied, wiping sweat and flour from his brow. He caught himself smiling, surprised at how naturally the smile came. They worked through the morning, sawing, hammering, patching. Eli learned how to hold nails steady. Lydia showed Margaret how she tied knots from the rope she'd found. The chores became a rhythm that braided them together, 3 sets of hands building a little more security into the place that had sheltered them. Stories shared by the woodpile. When they took a break, Jonathan sat on the bench near the woodpile while Margaret stacked more kindling. He found himself telling her small scraps of his life, how he and Clara had once rebuilt a fence together when the drought took their first harvest, how Eli used to fall asleep to his wife's humming, how Lydia still kept a ribbon she'd worn the day her mother had taught her to braid hair. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression open and kind. Then she offered stories of her own. A stubborn mare she'd nursed back to health, a time the spring thaw had washed out half a field, the way the seasons made a person both harder and softer at once. Loss doesn't end the world, she said at one point as she stacked a log and set it down carefully. It reshapes it. What's left is what we build from. Jonathan's throat tightened. He had built too many nights from worry and frayed hope. Hearing someone else speak of repair as a thing not only of wood but of the soul gave him courage he hadn't planned for. The children learned more than chores. Eli took to the ranch tasks like a fish to water. He learned to lead the mare to the loose stall and to refill the grain trough without spilling half of it. Margaret watched him like a proud aunt, correcting a grip here, praising a careful movement there. Lydia learned to mend small tears, threading a needle with care, pulling stitches tight so wind wouldn't find its way in. Margaret sat with her hand guiding the child's, teaching how to knot the thread so it wouldn't come undone. At one point Lydia looked up at Jonathan with flour-smudged cheeks and said, "Pa, Miss Margaret says when you fix things you're fixing the world." He laughed, then choked back the lump in his throat. She was right in a way he understood now. An evening that softens. That evening, after the work was done and the corral stood straighter than it had in years, they ate a simple supper together. Stew, thick bread, the last of Margaret's apple preserves. The fire hummed, shadows moving long and soft across the walls. "You could have stayed a night and left at first light," Margaret said quietly as they cleared plates. Jonathan set down a pot lid and met her eyes. "We can't leave the wagon like that. And I don't want to hurry off." The admission surprised him, honest and small and true. "You've given my children a Christmas those years stole from us. I can't explain what that means." "You don't need to explain," she replied. "Letting people help you is sometimes easier than you'd think." He reached across the table and caught her hand. This time he didn't pretend it was about tools or thanks. Their fingers closed, tentative but not afraid. Outside, winter breathed cold and measured. Inside, a different temperature, one made of steady hands and shared tasks, had taken hold. A quiet promise. As the children were tucked into bed, Eli with his new bit of splintered wood carved into a horse, Lydia clutching her ribbon, Jonathan and Margaret stood on the porch and watched the stars prick the black of sky. "You don't have to decide anything now," Margaret said, voice thin with thought. "But if you need rest or help with repairs or company, you know you've got it." Jonathan looked at her, at the line of her jaw, at the worry she hid behind a practical laugh, at the small courage that made her open her door to strangers in a storm. "No one's given me a door like this in a long time," he said. "I don't want to squander it." She smiled, and something in the way her eyes crinkled told him she understood the weight of that sentence. It was more than shelter. It was an invitation to start again, slow, careful, true. They stood together a long time, neither speaking, both listening to a winter that felt less like an enemy and more like a witness. When they went inside, the house seemed different, opened wider somehow, threaded with the footprints of 3 sets of souls who had left fear on the path and chosen to stay. Jonathan put a hand to Lydia's forehead once more that night, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing. He thought of the road ahead, the broken wagon, the uncertain job, the miles to the promised homestead. Problems remained. The world didn't suddenly smooth the edges of worry. But in the hush of that room, with a woman they no longer considered only the stranger, sleeping just down the hall, Jonathan felt a small, bright certainty. They were not alone. They might, with time and work and shared mornings like this, make a new kind of home. And that certainty was everything. The morning after the long day of repairs dawned clear and blisteringly cold. The blizzard had blown itself out overnight, leaving the world blanketed in thick, untouched snow. The sky was a pale, shimmering blue, the kind that appeared only after a storm had emptied itself. Jonathan stepped outside before anyone else was awake, his breath fogging the air. The wagon sat half buried in a drift, its broken wheel jutting sharply like a snapped limb. The sight made his heart sink, not from the damage alone, but from everything the wagon represented. His plans, his pride, and the journey he had insisted they had to take. He crouched beside the wheel, running fingers over the cracked spokes. "It's worse than I thought," he murmured. "You're up early." He turned. Margaret stood behind him, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, boots crunching softly in the new snow. Her cheeks were rosy from the cold, her expression gentle but perceptive. "Didn't sleep much," Jonathan admitted. "Kept thinking about this. About what comes next." Margaret walked beside him, examining the damage. "It's reparable," she said finally. "But not in a day. And not alone." Jonathan exhaled, long and slow. Asking for help was a skill he had never learned well. "I don't know how far we'd get even if we fixed it," he said quietly. "The railroad camp won't hold my job forever. And I don't want to drag Eli and Lydia across another stretch of winter road just to end up stuck again." Margaret's eyes softened. "Maybe you don't need to decide everything right away." But Jonathan shook his head. "I have to. They depend on me." As if summoned by their names, the cabin door creaked open and Eli spilled out into the cold with a burst of energy. Lydia followed, half hopping, half stumbling through the snow, her braids swinging wildly. "Pa," Eli called. "Miss Margaret said today we can help with the chickens. And she said I can paint the coop door blue." Lydia added proudly. Jonathan blinked, surprised. "Blue?" Margaret nodded. It needed repainting anyway. She leaned in, whispering conspiratorially. She wanted to make it sky color, so the hens feel like they have sunshine even on cloudy days. Jonathan gave a rare, light laugh. "That sounds like her." Lydia beamed, clutching the small tin of paint Margaret had given her. The work of morning. The chores turned into a kind of small celebration. Eli carried feed with seriousness well beyond his years. He learned how to coax the stubborn old rooster out of Margaret's woodbox. Lydia dipped her brush into the tin with theatrically slow precision, painting the coop door with thin blue strokes while humming Christmas songs under her breath. Margaret stood beside Jonathan as he checked the mare's hooves and the harness straps. "You're good with them," she said softly. "They're good kids. They didn't deserve the kind of wandering I've made them do." Margaret shook her head. "They deserve a father who does his best. That's what they've got." Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He inhaled the cold air, letting it fill his lungs, letting her words settle. A difficult conversation begins. When the chores were done and the children darted inside for warm cider, Margaret lingered with Jonathan near the barn, fingers curled around her shawl. "You're thinking yourself into knots," she said gently. "I'm trying to make the right choice." "Maybe there isn't one right choice," Margaret replied. "Just the choice that gives you room to breathe again." He met her eyes. "And what choice is that?" Margaret hesitated, the smallest crack in her composed exterior. "If you wanted, the cabin's got space. More than I need. The room you all used, it used to be my spare. I'd offer it longer than a night. Longer than a storm." Jonathan froze. She continued, voice steady but softer than he'd ever heard it. "I know you don't know me well. Not the way people usually do before sharing a roof. But these last 2 days, having you and the children here hasn't been a burden. It's felt," she paused, choosing carefully, "full. Alive. And I think maybe it's been good for all of us." Jonathan stepped closer, breath clouding between them. "Margaret, I don't want to impose." "You wouldn't be," she said firmly. "I'm offering because I mean it." Silence settled, warm, surprising, fragile. Eli's eavesdropping. A crunch of snow broke the quiet. Eli stood at the corner of the barn, pretending to inspect a lantern but clearly listening. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Eli," he called, "you all right there?" "Yes," Eli said quickly, too quickly. Then he walked over, glancing up at Margaret and then at his father. "Pa, if we don't have to travel until spring? I think Lydia'd like that." And he swallowed. "I kind of would too." Jonathan knelt. "You're not just saying that because it's easier here?" Eli shook his head. "I'm saying it because it feels safe." His gaze flicked to Margaret. "And because she's kind. Lydia said she feels like she can breathe here." Jonathan's chest tightened. Margaret blinked rapidly, touched. A choice made slowly but truly. Inside the cabin, Lydia had fallen asleep curled beside the hearth, one of Margaret's shawls tucked around her like a cocoon. Seeing her small body rising and falling with soft breaths, Jonathan felt something shift inside him. Not quickly, not dramatically, but like a door inching open after years of being stuck. Margaret caught him watching Lydia. "She's precious," she whispered. "Both of them are," he murmured. "They deserve more than I've been able to give since Clara passed." Margaret placed a careful hand on his arm. "You're giving them everything that matters." He looked at her, really looked, and saw in her eyes a softness he'd long forgotten existed in the world. A softness not born from romance or rush, but from shared losses, shared courage, shared quiet. In that moment Jonathan didn't have all the answers. But he knew one thing. He did not want to take his children back into a winter that had already tried to swallow them. "I think," he said slowly, "we'd like to stay, at least for a while. Until spring. If the offer still stands." Margaret's breath shuddered with relief. "It stands?" Jonathan nodded, feeling a weight lift off him. A weight he'd carried so long he almost didn't recognize the sensation of lightness. A promise quiet as falling snow. That night, as the children slept under quilts and Margaret banked the fire, she and Jonathan shared a cup of tea at the small kitchen table. No grand declarations were spoken. No plans etched in stone. Just two people sitting close enough that their shoulders brushed sometimes, quietly acknowledging that the world had changed around them. Not through a dramatic miracle. Not through a sudden declaration. But through kindness, shared hardship, and the simple act of surviving a storm together. Jonathan looked toward the window where snow fell again, this time gentle, harmless, peaceful. Maybe storms don't always take things away, he said quietly. Sometimes, maybe they bring something worth holding on to. Margaret smiled, eyes warm. Sometimes they do. And the room seemed warmer for it. Weeks passed in a rhythm that felt both new and strangely right. The cabin, once quiet and echoing with a widow's solitary routines, now hummed with the laughter of children, the thud of boots, the soft murmur of shared meals. Snow came and went in waves, but no storm since that Christmas Eve had held the power to frighten them. Jonathan took to the chores like he'd been born to the land. He fixed fence rails, cleared fallen branches, dug out the path to the barn when snow drifted high. Eli learned to split kindling safely. Margaret had taught him the trick of angling the blade and letting the weight of the axe do the work. Lydia had a knack for coaxing stubborn hens to lay in winter, declaring that the chickens liked her singing. Margaret watched it all with a heart that healed quietly. She hadn't realized how empty the house had become after her husband's passing. Not just in the physical way, a table meant for four being used by one, but in the spiritual way too. A house without voices eventually stops expecting them. A heart without laughter eventually forgets how to hold it. But the children reminded her. Jonathan reminded her. Life didn't end with loss, it simply changed shape. And she found she liked the new shape more than she'd expected. Preparation for the town winter market. One morning in mid-January, Margaret announced, "There's a winter market in town this Saturday. Folks gather to trade things they've made or grown or mended. It's small, but it's good company." Jonathan hesitated. Crowds still made him uneasy. Too many questions. Too many people wanting to know where a man came from, where he was going, what his plans were. But Eli lit up. Lydia clasped her hands in excitement. "Miss Margaret, can I bring the pine cones we sugared? And can I bring the painting I made? The one of the coop?" Margaret laughed, brushing a hand through Lydia's hair. "Of course. People love handmade things, especially from children." Jonathan looked at her, grateful. She always seemed to know exactly what the children needed. "All right," he said. "We'll go." A town that noticed. The town of Clearwater Ridge was small, just a handful of shops, a church with peeling paint, a schoolhouse that leaned a little when the wind blew. But on market days the place came alive with color and the smell of spiced bread. As the four of them walked into the square, bundled and bright-eyed, heads turned. Margaret wasn't a stranger. People knew her as the quiet widow with the neat cabin on the ridge. But Jonathan and his children were new. And seeing them walking beside her, like they belonged, started a ripple of whispers. A shopkeeper named Mrs. Hale approached first, wiping her hands on her apron. She nodded at Margaret, then at Jonathan. "So this is the family you sheltered through that terrible blizzard?" Margaret nodded. Mrs. Hale's gaze moved over Jonathan, then softened. "Well, you must have angels watching you. Not everyone gets a second chance at Christmas." Jonathan swallowed, feeling oddly seen, in a good way. Eli and Lydia set out their little goods on a small borrowed table. The sugared pine cones gleamed in the winter sun. Lydia's painted picture drew coos from several women, who declared she had an artist's eye. Jonathan watched them, a lump rising in his throat. They looked normal, happy, like children who had never feared the cold swallowing them. Margaret stood beside him, hands tucked into her muff, eyes warm. "You look lighter," she said. "I feel lighter," Jonathan admitted. "I didn't realize how long it had been." She tilted her head. "Since when?" "Since I felt like I belonged somewhere." Margaret's cheeks pinked, not from the cold, before she looked away. A gift for the future. Before they left town, Jonathan exchanged a quiet word with the blacksmith, then with the general store owner. He returned to Margaret with a wrapped bundle under his arm. "What's that?" she asked. "Something I've been needing," he said. "And something that might make things easier, for all of us." When they got home he unwrapped it, a sturdy iron wheel rim, wooden spokes and extra bolts. Margaret blinked. "You're fixing the wagon?" "Yes," he said. "But not to leave right away." She stiffened, not hurt but bracing. Jonathan stepped closer. "Margaret, spring will come. And with it choices. Real choices, not ones made in the middle of storms. But I want you to know something. He took her hand gently. The children, we want to stay. If you'll have us. Margaret's breath caught. I don't want to be just a guest. I don't want the children to feel like they're waiting to be moved again. We want to make this a home, with you. Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes before she could stop them. She laughed self-consciously and wiped at her cheek. You have no idea, she whispered, how long I've prayed for a family at this table again. Jonathan's hand tightened around hers. A new beginning at the hearth. That night, the four of them shared a simple supper: stew, fresh bread, Lydia's lopsided berry tarts. Afterward, Jonathan stoked the fire while Margaret poured tea. The children dozed nearby, soft and warm under thick quilts. Jonathan sat beside Margaret at the table. No rush. No fear of saying too much. Just peace. I don't know what the future holds, he said quietly. But I know where I want it to start. Margaret breathed out, like someone releasing a weight she had carried too long. Right here, she said. He nodded. Right here. Their hands met on the table. Natural. Steady. Certain. Outside, snow began falling again, not with the violence of the storm that had brought them together, but gently, like a blessing scattered from the sky. A soft wind pressed against the cabin walls, almost like a sigh of contentment. Inside, a new family shaped by storms, steadied by kindness, knit together by hope, closed their first chapter together. It wasn't Christmas Eve anymore, but it felt like Christmas all over again. And Jonathan knew as he looked at Margaret, that sometimes the miracle you pray for doesn't come wrapped in light or thunder. Sometimes it comes as a warm cabin during a blizzard. Sometimes it comes as a stranger at the door with a lantern. And sometimes it comes as a future you never dared hope for.